Chapter 22 Successor. Elliot Carlton was having a lousy day. He snarled at his computer as it froze for the 10th time. Lately, it seemed as if every time he interacted with technology besides his bots, something got in the way. His computer would crash, or fail to connect to the server, or buffer for hours, to name a few instances. It wasn't just his computer either. Traffic lights had developed a grudge against him, different telemarketers were calling him every 5 minutes, and his thermostat app had gone bipolar, switching between 90 degrees and 40 degrees no matter how many times he reset the stupid thing. All of these tiny annoyances piled up until he was ready to put his fist through the randomly brightening and dimming screen. His anger at Swarm wasn't helping. He'd underestimated the other super, but the humiliation of his first true loss hadn't receded. He couldn't figure out where he'd gone wrong. His initial plan to lure out the other super had worked like a charm. He'd caused the panic, trapped the hostages, and made enough of a stink that Swarm had felt the need to respond. The minor hiccup of grabbing different types of people than intended hadn't had much of an effect in the long run. As it stood, he couldn't regret it. The car crash had been unplanned, and he still felt bad about it, so when he'd seen the girl about to get pancaked, he hadn't hesitated to trap her and the people closest to her. She didn't deserve to get smushed because of his actions. He'd claimed he'd wanted to hurt the hostages, but that was a lie to ensure their cooperation. Pretending he hadn't realized she was a kid was only to keep his menacing persona intact. Not that any of the hostages had seemed too intimidated. He'd been surprised by how well the girl especially had managed to keep her composure under the circumstances. The first time he'd seen the thief, he hadn't been nearly as impressed. The wannabe vigilante was an idiot and a jokester. For Christ's sake, his opening attack had been to throw a shoe at his face. That he needed such a moron alive, allegedly, had spurred him to chase him around with the spike trap. Killing him was tempting, but the risk that the twerp had been honest about the inheritance protocols was too great. Didn't matter. A paralyzed Swarm posed barely more danger than a dead one. Once he got caught, Elliot could take him and run his own tests on the bots and the host. Success had been in reach, too, until the police had shown up and ruined everything. He'd retreated in the face of superior numbers, and Swarm had escaped. After the sting of failure had faded, he'd had time to realize the thief wasn't a total moron. Swarm was new to being a superweapon, and of course he hadn't had the time to learn the ins and outs. He of all people should know the nanotech's complexity. Even his own training bots with all their limitations were scientific marvels. For a normal person with no experience, 3 months would be enough time to get a handle on the preset constructs and little else. Human minds simply weren't designed to support constructs without the bot's assistance or practice. The presets in the true nanotech functioned similarly to Prince Snow's training bots. The tech held the blueprints for constructs in a database, and the user's neural impulses or motions recalled the correct one. The workload distribution wound up as 10% brain, 90% code. It took a long period of acclimation for someone to wean themselves off that. Swarm was actually doing quite well. What he lacked in skill, he made up for in creativity and quick thinking. Even so, Elliot had more experience. Prince Snow should have succeeded. He'd thought it over that night and come to a decision. He didn't want Swarm dead, not once he got over the anger. If Swarm was telling the truth, he was a bystander caught up in circumstances out of his control and was reacting to Prince Snow's actions out of a misplaced sense of obligation. Keeping Swarm alive, if death wasn't the trigger for inheritance, wouldn't be too much of a risk, especially once Prince Snow gained the bots. Swarm was far from vicious. Hadn't he proven that during their first encounter? If that boot had been a javelin, Elliot would be dead. No, Swarm would be safe once made normal again. Plus, having someone around to talk to about what it was like to be a full host wouldn't be bad at all. If Swarm was lying about his innocence in Lord Static's murder, unlikely, Elliot could force him to reveal his methods and come up with countermeasures. He'd exploit Swarm's capabilities for his own gain, the way he'd tried to do with Faye. In hindsight, the plan to involve Faye had been made too quickly. He'd been too eager to get the bots and had relied too heavily on Swarm's cooperation. The fight to get him to the park should have been his first clue that it wouldn't be easy, but the thrill of getting one over on his opponent had been too good. Swarm's seeming acceptance once in the park had lulled him into a false sense of security. He'd even felt comfortable enough to toy and be honest with the smaller super. The attempted peace offering had raised his spirits, leaving him vulnerable to Swarm's last-minute change of behavior. In the end, Swarm had only been protecting himself every time he spoke up between the capture and the race. The race had solidified Prince Snow's respect for the thief. He himself may have been handicapped, but Swarm had still shown an eye for tactics and a determination that demanded acknowledgement. He was no pet. He had the potential to be an equal with a little refinement. Was this what Lord Static had seen in him? Wasn't that thrilling? Wasn't it awful? Unlike his mentor, he'd wanted to snuff out that light. He'd nearly succeeded. Faye stopping him had been a good thing. Dead Swarm meant lost nanotech. Potentially. In the end, he and Swarm had gained an understanding, and he had merely been delayed. He would find out the secret to those inheritance protocols, and he would take back what Swarm had stolen. After that, Swarm's fate belonged to him. The temperature was rising. Again. He opened his thermostat app. A brown, probably red in actuality, 90 sat front and center of the screen. Again. He turned it back to 68 for the 10th time this morning and slammed his phone down on the table hard enough to shake the entire setup and crack the screen protector. This was ridiculous. He needed some air. He left his gauntlets and deactivated bots on the table next to his keyboard. He wanted to keep a low profile, and wearing those would look either extremely suspicious, extremely stupid, or both. It wasn't worth carrying them around, since it took too long to put them on. Instead, he slid a pair of knives into his sleeves and sheathed a pair in his boots. He left his apartment and headed for his favorite diner. He wanted something greasy and bad for his arteries. Something with enough sugar to give a bull elephant diabetes sounded good, too. His apartment was located in a decent area of the city. Calabria had been on an economic decline for several years, as evidenced by the empty stores and homes between him and his destination, but the residents in this district still took care of their homes. Lawns were kept garbage-free, if long, and paint never got too faded. As he walked, the houses and lawns got smaller and closer to the sidewalk until the green space was barely big enough for a trellis garden and the homes were 3 rooms at best. That didn't stop the occasional passerby from giving Elliot a friendly nod. All in all, it wasn't a bad place to live, though that might change in a decade or so. He was fantasizing about French fries when something with thorns latched onto his arm. The knife in his sleeve fell into his hand with a flick of his wrist, and he had stabbed the thing before his brain had processed what was happening. The vine was pitch black, pulsing, and thick as his wrist. He ripped the knife out, and the injury spurted sap that looked way too much like blood to come from a plant. The vine tightened, but a flurry of slashes made it let go. He was too focused on the first vine to see the second before it grabbed his ankle. He unsheathed his other knife and stabbed that one too, but more kept coming. They originated from the door of a house he'd been walking past, one in worse shape than the others on the block. For every one he got rid of, 3 more came through the door. Someone shouted, "I'll call the police!" Before he could tell them not to, tendrils slithered around his arms and mouth and yanked him into the abandoned house. He bit down and was thrown into a wall. Before he could cry out, a boot connected with his diaphragm. He choked and dropped his knives. While he fought to breathe over the searing pain in his chest, a gloved hand grabbed him by the hair and yanked him up. Through bleary eyes, he saw dirty blonde hair and a sneering mouth before getting dropped. He hit the ground again. A voice, female, snorted. Some successor. Lord Static put up so much more of a fight. I had to set a trap for him, and he still managed to banish my creature before dying. Are you sure he taught you anything? As though she expected him to defend himself sans bots and with half his organs rearranged. He glared up at her as best he could. She responded by digging the heel of her boot into his back. From what he could see, she was tall and muscular, dressed in a gray bodysuit with yellow-brown accents. Her boots were thick and heavy. Her hair was tied back in a bun, and a black gaiter covered the lower half of her face. Tinted goggles akin to the ones Swarm had worn during their second encounter hid her eyes. She had a gun with a silencer on her hip. She twisted her heel for no reason he could see. Then again, he didn't keep you around for your combat prowess, did he? Now he was confused. Of course he wasn't as good at fighting as Lord Static had been. That was what the training had been for. What are you talking about? Playing innocent isn't cute when people like us do it. He twisted as best he could to retrieve one of his fallen knives and swiped at her ankle. It was a bad angle to start, and the leather of her boot caught most of the force. He barely drew blood. Despite that, it was more than enough to anger his attacker. She kicked the knife out of his hand and stomped on his fingers. He screamed in pain, but that wasn't enough for her. She grabbed him by the shoulders and threw him into the wall. Instead of hitting it, the thorny felt-like vines grabbed him, trapping him even more thoroughly than phaser roots had. There would be no going for his other knives, even if his dominant hand wasn't throbbing. He flexed it. Not broken, but close. He wasn't gagged, but struggling would dig the thorns deeper into his skin. He was already in bad shape. A cut vein would take him out of the game for good. He gritted his teeth and glared at his attacker. Her face shifted, though he couldn't tell what expression she was making. When she reached for his chin, he snapped his teeth at her. Unfortunately, he missed. She tutted. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, little prince. I get testy when provoked by nuisances, especially when I've already dealt with a superior model." Anger flared, and he forced it down. This situation was a far cry from fighting merciful, inexperienced Swarm. One misplaced outburst, and he was as dead as his mentor. Why bother with me if I'm nothing but a nuisance? "That's a long story," she purred. "The short version is that Lord Static was the beneficiary of a substantial number of exceedingly profitable cybercrimes. My group wanted him to put his skills to better use. Let me guess, he said no. 3 times. My bosses decided if he wouldn't join us, beat him, and you know how that went. Too much of a liability, you see." That was why Lord Static had been killed? Simple greed? It was so out of left field he felt the urge to laugh. So why harass me? That's the funny thing. The vines pulsed in threat. You'd think after the perpetrator died, the crimes would stop. That's not the case. Oh, the pattern shifted, but the crimes are still being committed. Your lord wasn't working alone. I don't know anything about any cybercrimes. Why aren't you going after Swarm instead? She grabbed his hair and yanked his head back, baring his throat. Liar. You're the one going on and on about being the rightful heir and all that crap. Don't try to sick me on the competition. A vine looped around his throat and tightened. Black spots were dancing across his vision by the time the vine relaxed. Are you done? She didn't wait for a reply. Don't worry. If you're telling the truth about your innocence, Swarm will be my next target. You'll be too mauled to appreciate it, but it's the thought that counts. He was heaving for breath. Words weren't coming. Had he been able, he would have yelled at her to leave them alone, that neither of them knew anything, that Swarm was his, damn it! As it stood, he couldn't so much as whimper. His attacker stepped back. You have 1 week to make your decision and set your affairs in order. Join my group or meet your master's fate. Come back here once the week's up. If you don't, it will be seen as a refusal. If people come looking for you, I will kill them. If your disappearance is in any way suspicious, you'll face the consequences. I suggest you take excellent precautions. Don't I get 3 attempts too? Even that short speech burned his throat. He needed water. No, you're less useful than Lord Static would have been. Feel lucky I'm giving you time to set your affairs in order. 1 chance. Better make it count. She drew her gun and pointed it at his head. His eyes widened, and he shouted, Hey, wait, I have a week! The barrel shifted an inch, and the bullet whistled past his ear. It hit the wall behind him. As soon as it did, the vines restraining him shattered into light. He landed on his face. By the time he got up, the woman was gone. He couldn't go to the diner in this state. Not only were his injuries obvious, but he was covered in dust and blood sap, and his clothes were torn. His stomach hurt too much to eat, and his ears were ringing. Silencer was a misnomer, but without it the shot would have popped his eardrums. Before he left, he checked the wall behind him. An intricate design had been drawn right where he had been pinned. It looked like a mandala, but instead of being rounded, the outline was jagged, and the repeated patterns close to the edge resembled a hole torn by something too large trying to exit through a too small opening. Inside the hole, the pattern resembled a swirly fractal, one dizzying to look at. It had been drawn with something that either was blood or resembled it a great deal. The bullet had blasted through a part of the outer edge. Interesting. To be on the safe side, he gouged a break in the pattern with the knives that had been dropped. Police sirens were his cue to leave, and he headed out the back as black and whites pulled up to the front. The trek home was short but painful. Residual nausea slowed him down, and blood soaked into his clothes from the scrapes the floor and thorns had given him. The tinnitus refused to fade no matter how much he rubbed his ears. His neighbor, a sweet old lady with a plethora of grandchildren he couldn't bother to keep track of, was coming out as he was going in. He was in such rough shape she offered to take him to the hospital. He declined and scooted inside as quickly as he could. A casserole was going to wind up on his doorstep later, he just knew it. As he patched up his injuries, he started to shiver. Freaking thermostat. He never had this much trouble with tech before. When had it started? Less than a week ago. What had he been doing? The realization brought a nasty smile onto his face. Swarm. He'd started having problems once he'd gotten Swarm hurt. Swarm was the root of his recent problems, and he needed incredible technological skill to pull those pranks off. Exactly the type of skill his attacker had been talking about. The thief had stolen more than technology when he'd taken the nanobots, it seemed. Alternatively, he may have been involved with Lord Static before his death. Maybe he was the coder behind the cybercrimes and had double-crossed his employer. Maybe he was the coder and had been there by accident regardless. So many possibilities. One thing was obvious. He needed to pin down Swarm. Lying about his own capabilities would last him until he had to actually do something, and he'd be killed once his still human-level programming skills were outed. Swarm, meanwhile, had claim to the talent that would keep him alive once handed over. Of course, Elliot could always steal the bots and see whether his theory about them being the source of the coding ability was correct before turning Swarm into a sacrifice. The more he considered that idea, the better he liked it. His goal all along had been to retrieve his mentor's magnum opus. It was his due as the man's student. The prize had gotten shinier with this revelation, was all. He considered how to corner Swarm all night, but had few ideas. Swarm was too savvy to get drugged again and too wary to spill secrets if asked directly. He had nothing beyond approximate height, likely age within 10 years, and sex to make a guess at the guy's secret identity. Calabria was a small city, but it wasn't that small. Finding Swarm's civilian persona in under a week was destined to fail. That left him where he'd been the last few times he'd lured out the thief. Attack somewhere big and hope the other super would show. The odds were good, but not 100%. Besides that, he needed a target. Going after the same place twice would be tacky. He spent the next morning poring over maps and practicing with his bots. He was debating between attacking the police station, a bank, and a nice restaurant when a notification dinged on his phone. He opened it warily, half expecting to be rickrolled. To his surprise, it was something from the program he'd set up to alert him about public sightings of Swarm. A selfie starring someone who looked like an upgraded Swarm and a trio of teenage girls had been posted 10 seconds ago. Elliot studied the image and caught sight of a familiar cafe in the background. The thief was in Calabria's central square. He scrapped his plans. They hadn't worked the first 2 times, and he had no better chance than this. If he was going to catch Swarm before his time was up, he had to do so now. His hand was still stiff, but that didn't matter. He could compensate. He was out the door, costume hidden in a backpack, before he could consider why his greatest enemy would be out in public in the first place.